Hanson, engage.
I have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Give us some men who know the truth. And who will declare the truth. And who will stand with Athanasius and Polycarp and Calvin and Luther and Whitefield and Edwards, and who will declare from the housetops that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation.
Welcome to the Engage Truth podcast and YouTube show. I'm so excited to have you guys joining us today. We're on Engage Apologetics Facebook page and on our YouTube channel as well. And on this channel, we make the case that Christianity is total truth for all of reality. And I'm so excited about the episode that we have today. We have a special guest joining us today. But before we get started, I just want to encourage you guys to like and subscribe and put in some comments or questions. All of those things help the algorithm and more people to engage with our content. And I believe we're putting forth excellent content to help people understand that the biblical worldview is true all the way from Genesis to Revelation. We have good reasons to trust in God's word. And also I want to wish my sister happy birthday today. Carrie, happy birthday. I don't know if she's watching or I'll catch it later. And today is the last day of our fundraiser for our ministry. That we have a t-shirt fundraiser going on right now for the Conversation Starter t-shirt on 3 reasons the resurrection is true. I'm going to go ahead and pull it up here for you guys real quick. So you see that shirt there. You can buy that shirt by midnight tonight. The fundraiser will end. I want to encourage you guys to go buy that and help support the ministry, and also give you an excuse to go engage with people. If you want the accompanying blog on these 3 reasons the resurrection is true, I'll put that in the comment section later. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring on my guest today, Nate Loper. Nate, how are you doing today, brother? It's so good to have you.
Good to be back with you again, Caleb. It's great to see you, buddy.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. I'm so excited to have you here. And the number one topic I am discussing with Nate almost every day is the global flood. And,
day and night, Caleb. Day and night.
Yeah, man. We can't. I love it. I love it. It's, we had Nate on for like the early episodes when I started this show, and you can see we've had a little upgrade since. And I'm real excited just having you back on. Nate works with Canyon Ministries, has for several years, and has done a phenomenal job as a tour guide with them. I want to let you tell a little more about yourself, what you do with Canyon Ministries, and what else you're studying right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, been with Canyon Ministries now for going on, this will be my 7th year with them. And so we do tours at the Grand Canyon for the most part. It's kind of our main focus. Now going on 24 years, it'll be this next year. So if you want to throw that slide up there, I can show some little bit of what we do there. Canyon Ministries was founded back in 1997 by Tom and Paula Vale. And Tom had been a longtime river guide doing river trips to the Grand Canyon since 1983. And came to Christ along that time and decided to take people through the Grand Canyon from a Christian biblical, creation perspective, you might say. Since then, God has grown the ministry to all sorts of different things. So not just river trips anymore, but we're doing daily rim tours up at the Grand Canyon, daily hiking tours up there. We're doing backpacking trips. Like we just recently did a rim to rim 4-day backpacking trip across the Grand Canyon, but expanding into other places too. So going up into Utah. I mean, basically all around this big Colorado plateau, we're hoping to kind of get the voice out there, for the kingdom, and basically be a voice in the wilderness, you might say. And it's been fantastic. I mean, every year now we have between 2,000 and 3,000 people that come through our ministry doing river trips and rim tours and hiking tours with us. So I get the amazing privilege and opportunity to be able to work as one of the directors of the ministry and continue to grow this thing as God enables and God brings people our way. So Caleb, it's exciting, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am, Lord willing, gonna join you guys on one of these tours in the near future. But I not even gone on a tour yet, I can tell you I love Canyon Ministries, and I hope that everybody watching today will go ahead and talk with their spouse or whoever they need to, ministry leader, and go sign up for these tours today with Canyon Ministries. And you have to do them pretty early in advance. Is that right?
Yeah, the river trip especially. So our river trip list fills up about a year to year and a half in advance. So we tell people if you want to get on a river trip, sign up as soon as possible. We even have a wait list on there. So if our current season is filled up, you can be one of the first to know. But our daily tours, I mean, you can book those. Some of those you can book the same day actually and do a tour that very day. And those are offered every day except for Sundays. So 6 days a week, we're doing daily rim tours, a morning tour, a 4-hour sunset tour, 8-hour full day tour. And then we also have daily hiking tours and walking tours. And we're trying to get everything covered from the river to the rim and everywhere in between to show God's amazing creation at this amazing place, you know?
Yeah, man, that's so awesome. And that's good to know that if you just decided, hey, you know what, I want to go to the Grand Canyon next week, that you could get a rim tour. That's really good and helpful to know.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, is there snow at the Grand Canyon right now?
There's a little bit. We just got a couple inches recently, so in the shaded areas, there's still a little bit of snow lingering. We haven't yet got a real good snowstorm, but yeah, we're at 7,000 feet in elevation at the rim of the canyon. So we end up getting, between 2, 3, maybe 4 feet throughout the season, and it is fantastic. It's beautiful. I mean, few people come to the canyon during the winter, but it is absolutely stunning. The white and red layers that you see, because of the snow falling on some of the rocks of the canyon. Caleb, it's one of my favorite times of year up there.
Yeah,
and we do tours during winter too, so come on out.
Do you really? I guess you probably don't do the raft tours in the winter though.
We don't. The rafting tours basically are spring through the end of summertime, but the rim tours and things like that, we do those basically every day of the year, except for a couple holidays here and there, So
yeah, well, and it's a great time for amazing pictures. Is the winter right now? So now let's get into why Canyon Ministries cares so much about giving people tours. Like why should we care about the Grand Canyon, and like why does it matter, and how does that even relate to the biblical timeline and so on?
Yeah, I mean, we have about maybe 6.5 million people a year that come to see the Grand Canyon. Nations all over the planet come here, Caleb, to come and see this amazing place. And with that, it gives us an amazing collective of people that come to see God's glory. Creation reveals a creator. The heavens, cry out. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the rocks cry out of the canyon that we see. And so it's an amazing opportunity to take God's creation and to show it to people, and not just from an apologetics, point of view. That is part of what we do is creation apologetics in the flood. But there's so much more to it, Caleb. When you can understand the message, the redemptive message of what the flood tells us, and the redemptive message of Jesus Christ on that cross, I mean, there's so much to it. People leave these tours and they say, man, I expected to come and learn some things about rocks and have some good views, but I'm left, recharged and equipped and just, ready to go and do the ministry. And that's really what we do. We focus on basically Christians, and people that kind of have an understanding of God's word a little bit, but need to be equipped, you might say, so they can engage, you might say, the truth, and they can engage with that, and they can take that message of the canyon into all the world. So our job, really, we see it is to train up, to build, to equip, and then to send forth, basically be a voice in the wilderness to, declare the kingdom of God. And what a fantastic, amazing place to do it at, because so many people are already there.
Yeah, amen. And I think this is so important and so needed right now in ministry like this, that really we have a lot of the secular culture saying that the Grand Canyon is a monument to how ridiculous the global flood is, or is a monument to this doesn't even fit in with Genesis. But you guys are saying the opposite. No, it's a monument to God's glory and confirming the Genesis storyline. So we're going to unpack that some more, and we may have some viewers who are like, well, I'm not sure the flood even happened, and how does the Grand Canyon fit in with that? I'm looking at the national NPS.gov, National Park for Arizona. They'll say like the Grand Canyon, maybe 70 to 30 million years ago, through action of plate tectonics, the whole region was uplifted, resulting in the high and relatively flat Colorado Plateau. So you have things that would really make it difficult, even from genealogy perspective, of how would the flood even fit in there. But we're going to talk through some of these issues. Well, let's look at this issue we brought up with what I just read, the Colorado Plateau. What is the Colorado Plateau, and how do you think that even formed?
It's a great question, Caleb. So the Colorado Plateau is basically, as you can see here, a big kind of boundary area that encompasses the four corners of Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. It's really an uplifted plateau, but unlike most plateaus that are kind of flat straight across, the Colorado Plateau actually has a nice rim all around it, kind of a ring of mountains, you might say, and it actually creates a natural bowl-shaped basin in it. Anyhow, the Colorado Plateau, in my opinion, what I like to call it, Caleb, it is America's playground, my friend. On the Colorado Plateau, we have so many national parks. I mean, the Grand Canyon is on the Colorado Plateau. We have Zion National Park. We have Bryce National Park, Canyonlands, Arches. So many national parks and national monuments are in the middle of this giant Colorado Plateau. Fantastic desert landscapes and all the way up to alpine mountains and rivers and streams. I mean, to me, it's my favorite place on earth. I mean, I can say that, basically living most of my life on the Colorado Plateau. I love it. It is home to me. Born here in Arizona, grew up in 3 of those 4 states. And boy, there is so much to see and do around here. But geologically, the Colorado Plateau is also fascinating because it gives us insight in many ways to the geology and the inner workings of the earth. The Grand Canyon is a great example of that. We see at the Grand Canyon basically a mile deep cut into the earth, a mile down through sedimentary, down into some igneous and metamorphic layers down at the very bottom. We really see kind of a slice, if you will, of basically what the earth looks like in many other places. We just happen to have a nice giant canyon cutting into it. And because it's in a desert environment, we don't have a lot of, trees and growth and jungle, you might say, covering it up. So we actually see the geology of this. Now, the Colorado Plateau, as you mentioned, many geologists, from the secular perspective, would say that the Colorado Plateau began to uplift about 70 million years ago. Now, when we look at those kind of models, we look at a biblical creation perspective, that if you look at the days of creation as being literal 24-hour days, we have 6 days of creation. The 7th day, God rested. And then you have in there genealogies that are given to us in the Bible from Adam, and you can begin to add up all those ages. Looking at what the Bible plainly reads, we come to the conclusion that the earth is perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 years old. So then, fitting that into what they say 70 million years for a process, that's really where things come, we have to talk back and forth on. Now, honestly, to be honest with you, a lot of the processes we actually are on the same page on. It's the time involved and how quickly things happened that comes up to be the question. Right. One of the things that the secular geologist community would discount entirely would be a global flood event. Right. And if you really truly believe God's word in the book of Genesis 6, 7, and 8, when it talks about this flood, you realize that this would be the largest geological change the world has seen before or since. We're talking about a major worldwide catastrophe and a lot of processes, a lot of geological processes, you might say, happening very, very quickly. So to understand the Colorado Plateau, I actually believe many, along the same lines of what other geologists believe, with the exception of the time involved in the processes, the mechanism. Typically we would say that the Colorado Plateau was uplifted during what we call the Laramide orogeny. It's basically a mountain building time period. As the North American plate was sitting over here on the western coast, you have other plates that are kind of going down into like the Farallon plate. The remnants we see of that today is what we call the Juan de Fuca plate. But if one plate kind of subducts down into there, it gets down into the liquefied mantle on the rocks and the asthenosphere of the earth. Things begin to melt and they begin to uplift, and that pressure begins to push up certain areas inside the continent. We have these uplifts. We have these kind of uplifts and then downhills. We have throughout kind of the western United States, we have big mountains like the Rockies going all the way down through the Andes. And then we have, uplifted sections, and we have, sections that have kind of sunk down. The Colorado Plateau, we believe, is one of those uplifted sections. And so if you see here, you've got a plate going over on the left-hand side towards the west coast there, kind of the Farallon plate, and it's pushing down. As it pushes down, it begins to melt down in the earth, and then that liquefied, melted rock wants to rise up through, very much like a lava lamp. and it creates and uplifts mountains, and entire ranges can be lifted up. And so we see the same processes, you might say, that are taught in everyday secular geology. However, rather than slow continental drift, like you might hear about over millions of years, we believe kind of in continental sprint, during this process of the flood, we would have volcanoes and earthquakes going off around the planet. During this time, we believe the continents were broke apart and they moved rapidly. Basically, the same processes, but fast forwarded by much bigger processes taking place around the world. But it basically uplifts this Colorado Plateau. And we have this, what I believe took place near the end of the flood and continuing on perhaps for a few hundred years, even after the flood, Caleb. In fact, we have volcanic activity. We have volcanoes that have erupted just a few miles north of my house here as recently as 1,000 years ago.
Wow.
So this process of volcanism, of uplift, of change of the landscape today is much slowed down compared to what it was at the time of the flood or shortly thereafter. But I still think a lot of this activity is a result, a slowed down remnant, you might say, of the flood, including the uplift of this Colorado Plateau.
Yeah, wow. And thank you so much for breaking that down. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the Farallon plate still a little cool, actually?
Yes, you can see it. They've done, thermal tomography where you can actually see what's underneath the earth. And they actually been able to identify kind of a cold slab, if you will, down at an angle that has not yet melted, not yet liquefied.
Wow.
And so it's an indication, perhaps this plate did not subduct as recent or as long ago as what has been proposed, but maybe it's a recent subduction.
Yeah.
In other words, if it only subducted maybe, a few thousand years ago, 4,500 years ago, perhaps, then looking at that event, we could still have a plate that has not yet liquefied.
Yeah, so we would expect in a biblical creation model that it's still fairly cold, as exactly what we find. So what is the main secular model with the forming of the Colorado Plateau? Like they still have a similar mechanism, but you said it's the time that's the biggest difference?
Absolutely. They have the same mechanism, except for the time involved. You're taught oftentimes that there's continental drift, the process of millions and millions of years. The continents have slowly been moving. And that's because today we see slow, gradual movement. We see what they refer to oftentimes as uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism, big, long, fancy word, basically means slow, gradual, uniform change that's given enough time can account to big features adding up. And that was really a word that was proposed and really pushed by a guy named Charles Lyell. And back in 1853, Charles Lyell wrote a series of 3 different books called The Principles of Geology. He's kind of the father of modern day geology, if you will. And he kind of argued for the present being the key to the past. In other words, if you want to understand what happened in Earth's ancient past, well, just look at today's present rates of slow, gradual changes, slow, gradual processes. So today, if everything's happening very slowly, that must have been how it's always been since the beginning of time. And so if slow processes today have always been taking place, it must take millions and millions of years for big features to be accounted for. And so the idea of uniformitarianism really is what most geologists grab hold of today. Uniformitarianism, perhaps with some punctuated big events here and there. But for the most part, we look at slow, gradual drift. Continent plates are still moving very slowly today. So the assumption is if there's no flood, then it's all slow, gradual. So if we get big movement, that must have taken millions of years. So that's where the millions of years come in. The processes, though, of uplift are very, very similar in many ways. In fact, I've gone to a number of conferences and events by well-known geologists around here. And I would say, Caleb, 90% of what they're talking and showing on the screen, yeah, I agree with. Then you come to the timeline and to how quickly are the processes, and that's where we're going to have a little bit disagreement. But there's actually, when you study geology, there's not as much disagreement as you would actually expect out there. Time is really the big thing at play.
That's fascinating. Now, but wouldn't it still be a problem for them to have a slow continental drift for mountains to form? Because it seems like you would need them to be faster, right? Like, well, the plate subduction to cause the mountains to go up quickly, or does it not require them to be fast?
Well, Caleb, we can't really observe mountains forming today. So that's where it comes into assumption on either side, For sure. We assume what has happened in the past. We look at, either we look at today's present rates and we assume that's how it always has been, or someone like me, I look at God's word, the Bible, believing that's true. So I use that as my starting point. And I believe that based upon the events found in the Bible, we would have a much bigger process taking place. So there is an assumption there. Absolutely. I mean,
Sure.
It is what we call historical science, or really just history. You can't observe the processes taking place to form an entire mountain. You can look today and maybe assume today's present rates have always been the same, or you can look at God's word and believe that a big event happened. But on either side of it, you still have to make some assumptions and look at it. So even from the secular model, yes, you might think that there might be some problems with it, but looking at how the mountains are uplifting today, they would assume that they've always been at that same steady rate, you might say.
Oh, so yeah, right. And they just add time and go.
You just add the time. Yeah, time.
Okay.
Time becomes the hero of the plot, you might say, the magic wand of evolution in millions of years. Really, the God replacement of a secular humanistic model.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to put it. So now let's focus in on this issue of what we're looking at in the background, and we have many slides on, is the main topic on the Grand Canyon itself. Because as we've talked about, the Grand Canyon is on the Colorado Plateau, but a lot of secular geologists who hold to the uniformitarian assumption would say, no, each of these layers represents several million years as you go down each layer and each sedimentary deposit. So now, what have been the popular theories on how the Grand Canyon layers relate down? We're going to talk about the cutting or the carving of the canyon in part 2 Friday, but we'll talk about the layers itself. What's the dominant viewpoint on this issue?
Right. So if we look at the Colorado Plateau, you can kind of identify where it is, Caleb. You can see on this kind of map I've got of the Colorado Plateau, it's down there in the kind of the bottom left corner. On the yellow map, you can see it's in red there. So that kind of identifies where the Colorado Plateau is in relation to there. So when it comes to the Colorado Plateau and the Grand Canyon, there's another plateau that we really need to talk about. And that's what we call the Kaibab Plateau. There's a few plateaus we have where the Grand Canyon goes through, but the Kaibab Plateau is the main one that most people talk about. It's the one they're most familiar with. And if you go to the Grand Canyon National Park on both North Rim or South Rim, you're going to be on the Kaibab Plateau. You'll be able to see it going straight across there. And most of that goes over to the north. So we kind of have the Coconino Plateau, the Kaibab Plateau. We've got different plateaus out to the west. But the canyon does go through a plateau. And so over the years, there have been a number of different theories proposed for Grand Canyon formation. Now, if we go back to the 1800s, one of the earliest ideas that was first proposed mostly by a guy named John S. Newberry. Newberry believed that the canyon was the result of a catastrophic water event, you might say. So he began to share and believe that looking at it, it looks as if a catastrophic amount of water came ripping through the landscape. And that was one of the dominant theories for a number of years until around 1869, 1872, when John Wesley Powell, the first geologist and explorer to ever go boating through the Grand Canyon in 1869, when he started proposing what he believed as kind of a river antecedent model. Because they looked at the Colorado River and they looked at this plateau that's uplifted. And early on, they realized that the plateau being uplifted is about 2,500 feet above the surrounding desert landscape. And if that was the case, and that river never could have rose up 2,500 feet to begin cutting down the plateau. Now, Powell realized this back in the 1800s. And so he proposed his river antecedent model, which basically, Caleb, tells us instead of like a knife cutting down through butter, imagine the knife would be the river and the butter is the plateau. Instead of a knife cutting downward through that butter, he imagined the knife sitting here and the butter, the plateau, rising up around the knife. So basically the river stayed fairly at the same elevation, but the plateau was pushed up and around it. And that plateau uplift had to be perfectly balanced for the amount of uplift compared to the amount of downcutting, basically. That was one of the long-held theories and ideas. However, there are very few geologists, in fact, I don't know any geologist personally, that still holds to that model. There are a number of problems that they've identified with that, even from the secular perspective and modeling, when it comes to things like dating the rim rocks of the Grand Canyon and looking at the landscape. They've really abandoned that uplift to downcutting idea, which is also reduced in the age of the Grand Canyon, because the plateau, they believe, was rising 70 million years ago. So for a number of years, they believe the Grand Canyon was starting to be formed 70 million years ago. However, they've now reduced the dating of that to a much younger age. They still say the plateau was about 70 million years. It started to lift up. But now they're kind of dating the Colorado River and the canyon itself going through there at about 5.5 to 6 million years.
Okay.
And that comes into a couple different models now. And that's kind of the stream capture theory, as you see here. The top one on the left kind of shows us one of the original stream capture theories that they had. And that was that the Colorado River was going down in a completely different direction. If you can see the Kaibito Plateau and the Paria Plateau up there, you can see where Marble Canyon comes in at on the right-hand side. And that river would be going downhill and then continue on down through the desert landscape, basically following the course of today's Little Colorado River down to the southeast. At the same time, they believed initially that there was what we call headward erosion on the plateau, that there was a stream going towards the west. And as all the water continued to flow down that channel, it continued to back cut, kind of a nick point erosion, kind of back cut or headward erosion, and eventually eroded backwards until it joined and captured that other river that was already going down. So that river joined and captured the Colorado River, and then collectively they reversed course basically and started flowing out towards the southwest. Now that was the original theory. However, a lot of changes happened in the last 40 years, and most geologists have abandoned that version of stream capture theory because we don't find the sediments expected to the east of there. If all this was happening, if Marble Canyon was coming through, all this erosion and cutout was happening before the stream was captured, we should find all that sediment dumped out to the east, and we don't. So most geologists have abandoned that version of stream capture theory at this point. And now one of the main ideas is that perhaps the Colorado River, if you look at the bottom section there, the Colorado River came in from the north as it does today. The Little Colorado River came up from the southeast as it does today. But instead of going straight out to the west and then down from there, it went up to kind of to the north, perhaps up what we call Kanab Creek, or a side canyon, or some kind of drainage going up that direction. And the process of headward erosion happened as it cut backwards, and then boom, it connected with the Colorado River, and the Colorado River then went basically straight west and to the southwest of there. That's kind of the most popular theory right now currently of stream capture theory. And I would say for the most part, that's what many geologists and people at the Grand Canyon are now teaching and believing. Oh, wow. However, not all of them, because there's a third model out there, Caleb. And not just from creationists or anybody, but everyday secular geologists that believe the Grand Canyon perhaps was a result or started as a result of a massive amount of water spilling through catastrophically. Wow, going back all the way to the 1800s. But we're going to talk about that on Friday, but basically a massive lake system that spilled through, basically breached over, so a breached dam or lake spillover perhaps, that breached through the Kaibab Plateau initially, and then a huge amount of water that came rushing through, catastrophically ripping out the Grand Canyon. Now, a few years ago, I was up at the park giving a tour, and as I was giving a tour, one of the national park tour guides, she came up, one of the rangers, she was going to do a tour. So at that point, I stopped what I was sharing and was going to listen in a little bit on what she was sharing. And we were up there at the Yavapai Geology Museum. If you've ever been up to the canyon, and some of you guys might be familiar with that. But we were up there with a big map of the Grand Canyon in front of her, and she started to share with about 30 people that were there listening in. And what she started off with, Caleb, amazed me. She started her talk by saying, so I know we're standing here in this geology museum, and around me right now, there are a lot of park signs that talk about the Grand Canyon Formation and how we believe it was formed. Now, these signs were put in here about 8 to 10 years ago. And since then, we've actually come up with a lot of new ideas, perhaps. So what I'm about to share with you might sound a little bit different than you're going to read over there. Oh, wow. And she started sharing about catastrophic processes perhaps being at play at work for the Grand Canyon Formation. And I thought, whoa, in 8 to 10 years, only the park is starting to change its tune. But not only that, they're now starting to look at this cannot be simply the process of slow, gradual mechanisms. There has to be some sort of catastrophic work at play here in one way or another. One of those geologists that actually you can see that talks about that is Dr. John Douglas. Now, John Douglas, you can see him on there's a show on the National Geographic Channel called Grand Canyon, How It Was Made. And in that show, Dr. Douglas talks about a lake spillover, a breached dam, and he kind of proposes that. Now, as far as I know, John Douglas is not a creationist or a Christian by any means, but he sees the physical evidence of not only the Grand Canyon, but the surrounding landscape. And as a result of that, puts together a catastrophic process that would help create the Grand Canyon. Now, we'll talk a lot about that on Friday, of course, because we're going to be talking about the carving of the canyon. Sure. But, this just kind of shows you some of the main models that have been out there that they've talked about over the past 150 years since Powell's been going down through there.
Yeah, that's so fascinating to hear, and just how things have kind of changed and modified, and that's how science works. We need to test ideas and challenge each other. And now I'm real excited. Of course, we'll get to Friday later on the carving, but obviously there's going to be overlap today on that. The actual layers themselves, I know we're going to look at here in a little bit, but I've read different models to the degree of, well, maybe the layers that are exposed in the Grand Canyon, those were laid down over rising and falling seas level, or is that the main theory from secular models?
Yes, it is. So they would say basically, for the most part, that the entire continent of North America was somehow either pushed down and or the sea rose over it and set on top of the landscape for millions of years. Slowly, sediments kind of fell out of the sea and began to accumulate at the bottom there, accumulating layers of sediment. And then the ocean retreated off the continent. And then it repeated that kind of back and forth process, back and forth up to 17 different times across the North American continent. Basically slow, gradual advancing and retreating of these seas. And each time it came through, it deposited some sediment, retreated, came back in, deposited some more, and then back and forth, back and forth. So that's kind of what their model would say to us, Caleb.
Now, would they say this is like a calm rising of the sea level, not like a catastrophic flooding? Or
they would, for the most part.
Okay.
For the most part, because the processes, they're not going to really go grab hold of a catastrophic process. I mean, when you start talking catastrophe in the geological community, that starts to sound like a flood, right? And in fact, some of those early scientists and geologists that were studying things like the channeled scablands up in the Missoula Lake area, they looked at the evidence and said this is a result of a catastrophic water event. And when he went to basically go give that presentation and talk about this big catastrophic water event, he almost got laughed out of the room because that sounded too much like Noah's flood, and all his fellow colleagues laughed him out of the room until they went up to there, saw the landscape, realized there was a big water catastrophe. And, they're not even necessarily saying the flood, but they saw the evidence of this. And you can actually go up there to this day. There's signs up there to talk about, their response to it and their realization. And in their own words, they said, how could we have been so wrong? Now, the whole idea, I mean, there's definitely a bias against any sort of catastrophe because it starts to look or sound like a global flood. So they're very reluctant oftentimes to talk about any sort of catastrophic event unless there's concrete proof to it, because it could sound or give, credence to a global flood event. Now, of course, Caleb, that's exactly what we're talking about. In our perspective, and my perspective of seeing the Grand Canyon, absolutely, we believe that there really, truly was a global flood event, as the Bible describes, in the book of Genesis, chapter 7, it tells us, Genesis 7:11 says, on the same day that God himself closed the door of the ark, it says the fountains of the deep broke forth, and then the windows of heaven were opened. The fountains, like tremendous geysers, tremendous volumes of water coming up from the depths of the earth or the depths of the ocean basins, a tremendous water event, Caleb. And we're not just talking about a little bit of raindrops. Unfortunately, we oftentimes kind of teach that in Sunday school books or cartoons, right? The rains came down and the floods came up. We kind of teach that cute little Sunday school song with nice, pretty pictures and cartoons and everyone kind of standing around the ark making fun of Noah until all of a sudden there's a raindrop on somebody's shoulder and another raindrop, and they look up to the sky and they say, what in the world is starting to rain? Maybe Noah was right after all.
Yeah.
My friend, that is not what the Bible describes the start or the trigger of the flood to be all about. The start of the flood, as indicated by scriptures, was actually the fountains of the deep. Mm-hmm. We're talking about a massive amount of water, and we're talking about a lot longer time than most people tend to think. If you actually read scripture from Genesis 7 all the way to Genesis 8 when they get off the ark and everything, we're talking about a year-long global flood of massive proportions. And so the difference would be a slow, gradual process or a very big, fast process. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the physical evidence of the big, fast water-moving process here in a little bit. But I want you to continue understanding what we're talking about when it comes to the layers of the Grand Canyon. We have one model of slow, gradual advance and recede, advancing and receding, retreating. And then we have another process of big, catastrophic. We talked about the flood. During this year-long flood process, we would have, volcanoes and earthquakes. We would also have, tsunami-like waves slamming into the continents, massive walls of water, pummeling across the continents, and tremendous currents taking place. But during this flood, during this year-long flood process, Caleb, not only do we have these processes taking place, but we still have other natural processes that would take place. For example, like the tide, So what creates our tide?
Isn't that the moon?
Yeah, you got it. Our moon. So the gravitational pull of the moon basically pulls upon the water on our surface, and it creates this tidal bulge or tidal wave, you might say, a swell of water. And we see the tide kind of rise up. It goes up against the shoreline. It can't quite get over the shoreline because the land is all in the way. As the moon continues, on and around, the gravity field is weakened, so the tide kind of sloshes back down. But we see it repeat itself twice a day due to the gravitational effects of the moon, right? Now, if you think about it, Caleb, what would the tide look like during a year-long global flood? It'd be pretty massive, right? Imagine all that water that could be pulled together. And more importantly, during this year-long flood, what's stopping or holding back the tide from advancing? Yeah, think about that for a minute.
Yeah.
If all the land is stopping it today, what's stopping it during the year-long flood?
Yeah, there's nothing to stop it.
Nothing, right?
Right.
So imagine, this of course is not to scale here, but if you look at this, it kind of gives you an understanding of maybe what we're talking about. Imagine a massive tidal wave or tidal swell, tidal bulge of water continually going around our planet, unhindered, unchecked, unstopped by the land because all the land is underneath it. This big swell of water can continually circle around and around our planet. As it comes around, this big massive wall of water is eroding landscapes. It's wearing down mountain formations. It's picking up all kinds of dirt and debris and mud and sediment, and it's carrying that sediment with it as it travels around the world. And as it travels and passes by, it deposits or leaves some of that sediment in the wake of that wave as it passes by. And then it comes around again and it lays down another layer of sediment on top of that, and another layer and another layer. It stacks up and builds up sediment, or it comes back around and erodes some of what it just laid down previously. But it stacks up layers of sediment very, very quickly, almost like making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, we like to say,
Yeah.
If I were to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you got your bread, which would be the land, you got your knife, which is that wave, and on that knife, you have all that peanut butter. You go and carry all that peanut butter. Most of that peanut butter is staying on the front edge of that knife, right? But as you're passing over, you're carrying over that bread, what are you doing? You're leaving behind a nice thin layer of peanut butter, right?
Yeah.
Then you go and get a big old glob of jelly and you lay that on top of it. Now you could add layer upon layer upon layer with each successive pass of that bread and make a big old sandwich like I like. In a very similar process, Caleb, to what this global flood would do. Massive walls of water picking up material, carrying it hundreds or even thousands of miles, and depositing it hundreds or even thousands of miles away, which is exactly what we find, my friend. So, for example, near the Grand Canyon, kind of right up at the beginning of it, we have a layer up there called the Navajo sandstone. And I should have put a picture in here with this. But the Navajo sandstone is one of the single thickest layers of sandstone on the planet. We see it across, this huge landscape environment here. And if you go to Zion National Park website, or actually up at the Zion National Park, one of the visitor centers, you can actually read and hear a sign that it talks about. And they basically say that the Navajo sandstone found present here, that geologists have used radiometric fingerprinting to kind of identify where it comes from. And they've determined that the majority of the Navajo sandstone comes from the Appalachian Mountains.
Wow.
Yet how it got from there to here kind of still remains a mystery.
Yeah.
Because this we're talking about is picked up and eroded from thousands of miles away, and it's transported across the continent and dropped here. Now, where are the Appalachians in relation to the Grand Canyon?
Oh, they're northeast from here.
Yeah, exactly. So to get something from east to west, basically, well, what also goes east to west when we look at it every day? Kind of have our rotation of the earth that kind of makes the sun and the moon, we see kind of an east to west movement. We would see east to west movement. In fact, that's what we do find. We find cross-bedded sandstone, these sand wave formations, and we typically can map those around the world, and the majority of them go from east to west or northeast to southwest around the world. Now, if you have a collection of sediment that's being carried from east to west predominantly, there had to have been a mechanism at play to carry that sediment. Now, the global flood, this tidal action that we're talking about, is the exact process that we're saying. This peanut butter and jelly layering sandwich event is the exact process we're saying when it comes to the formation of the majority of our layers of sediment throughout the world, including what we see here at the Grand Canyon. layer upon layer upon layer stacked up quickly, almost like laying down that stuff on a peanut butter and jelly sandwich to make it really simple and easy for us to understand.
Yeah, that's so exciting hearing about that, and I really like the analogy that you used about the peanut butter and jelly. I think that's helpful for people to get that visual there. But that long distance of sediment transport, I think, is huge, because what is the secular model to explain the mechanism, how it's coming from the Appalachians all the way over here? Well, I live in the Southwest, I say here. But
Yeah. So for the most part, most of the literature that I've read on that basically talks about wind-blown sand. That somehow we had wind currents that picked it up, that eroded off the Appalachians, and wind blew it over here. And of course, they don't want to say water, because water sounds like a catastrophic process, right? And so wind becomes the mechanism they would use, basically picked up and carried and dropped over here. But still, a continuous windstorm that continually brought sand that far of a distance and that great amount. I mean, this is a crazy storm. I mean, water, my friend, can move stuff so much easier and quicker. Water is a much more erosive and transport process than wind ever would be. But yet, I don't typically see much else besides a kind of wind-based movement. Although there are some that are now starting to change their tune on that and say, well, maybe, they're looking at maybe slow, gradual processes, and maybe that we had currents that carried water from one place to the other place. But it's been so entrenched that there's no such thing as a global flood water event that they don't even want to go down that rabbit hole sometimes.
Yeah, that just shows philosophical bias to the data. Now, that's so fascinating. So that's exactly the type of thing we would expect, the long distance sediment transport. Now, what we're looking at here is all the different sedimentary layers of the Grand Canyon. So what can you tell us about these? Do we find any of these layers widespread around North America and beyond? Or?
Yes, absolutely we do. Some of these layers are found throughout this entire region, crossing multiple states. Some of these layers, as we'll talk about in a little bit, actually go much further than that. But the diagram that we see here, if you look at it, Caleb, the horizontal layers that we see stacked up here, from the Kaibab limestone, the kind of the rim rock of the Grand Canyon, down to the Tapeats sandstone, are all kind of flat and horizontal we see there. Those are layers that we believe were deposited or laid down during this year-long flood in Noah's day, okay? And then underneath that, you can kind of see some tilted, angled rock layers, okay? You begin to go down there, you see the Cardenas, which is actually a basalt lava flow layer. From there all the way down to the Bass limestone, you can see that kind of tilted purplish layer. These are kind of tilted and angled layers, what we refer to as the Grand Canyon supergroup. Now, when we examine these layers, there's some really interesting things that come out here, Caleb. The layers that we look at, the sedimentary layers, the tilted layers, and the flat layers on top, we begin to examine them and we realize that there's a major difference between the two.
Yeah.
Not only are they at a different angle, geologists refer to that kind of contact point, that angle where they come together, as a great unconformity, where that Tapeats sandstone sits on top of the layers in the sediment and some of the basement rocks underneath there. They refer to that as an unconformity because the layers don't conform to each other, and thereby they don't conform in time. They would say there's millions of years of missing time, as we'll talk about in a minute. But the other thing that we find here that's really interesting is we find that basically from the Tapeats sandstone up to the Kaibab limestone, we find a huge amount of fossils, okay? Rapidly dead and buried things, basically.
Wow.
The fossil record is found in an explosive, existence from the Tapeats sandstone all the way up to the Kaibab limestone. But underneath that, the Grand Canyon supergroup layers, those tilted angled layers, they do not contain the fossil record to any great extent. We typically don't find anything beyond, things like stromatolites, which are kind of blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, mats that basically grow in calm and placid seas where a little bacteria colony grows, sand comes on top of it, and kind of gets on top, and they kind of grow up through that sand. So it kind of creates this layered, very thin layered of basically blue-green bacteria and sand or rock, So it basically creates a almost like a mushroom-shaped rock, you can see. But those are the evidence and result of typical calm and placid seas. What we don't find in the Bass limestone all the way up until we get to the Tapeats sandstone, what we don't find, Caleb, are big, dead and buried things of highly advanced, complex life forms. Life suddenly seems to explode into existence, they say, at that Tapeats sandstone. And it's what we refer to as the Cambrian explosion, or the Cambrian explosion of life, that you may have heard about.
Right.
And it is one of the largest mysteries to evolutionary biologists around the world. I mean, second only to how did life get its start? We still can't figure that out from that perspective. But looking at this, it is a worldwide physical feature, Caleb. Worldwide, we find basically no fossils, no fossils, no fossils, no fossils. Then boom, an explosion within the fossil record that represents nearly every major phyla of life known to man instantaneously.
Wow.
Basically going from no life to highly developed and complex life without steady, gradual evolutionary precursors to it. It's basically as if life suddenly exploded into existence, they say. And there are many shows and models and papers that they try to explain how that could have happened. One of my favorite ones recently, Caleb, actually came out, I think maybe 2 years ago I read it. They talked about maybe another proposal to how we have this worldwide explosion within the fossil record. And what they say is it appears from the fossil record and from geology around the world, we must have had some big major water event that swept over the continents and dumped all kinds of sediment and nutrients into the oceans. And that sediment bloom basically created an algal bloom and a life bloom within the oceans, that these small little things that were living in the ocean suddenly had all the nutrients and things available to bloom into existence and to become highly developed life forms. Now, they tie that into a basically worldwide water event sweeping over the continents. I love it. Worldwide water event, and we see an explosion within the fossil record. Now, that's exactly what we do see. We see evidence of a worldwide water event and an explosion within the fossil record, my friend.
Yeah.
But it's not an explosion of life. If you really understand what fossils are, they're not living things. They were once living, but they're dead. And by being rapidly buried, they're kept out of reach of scavengers, kept in an oxygen-free or anaerobic environment so they don't naturally decay and decompose. These fossils are evidence of rapid burial, so they're not, decomposing, getting eaten up by scavengers, but are becoming fossilized by the surrounding minerals that are replacing those organic components. Fossilization is a result of rapid burial. So what we find, these fossils are not really living things, Caleb. It's not an explosion of life. Rather, it's an explosion of
death.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Death in a moment's notice. What we see here with the Grand Canyon supergroup, these tilted layers, to us represents part of the pre-flood world. From creation until the flood, we had a world that existed, roughly 12 to 1600 years of time where the world existed, right? But we don't necessarily have worldwide death and burial until we get to the flood. Just like in today's present world, we have a world that exists. We don't find fossils forming left and right. In fact, few people realize this, but we don't find fossils forming in today's oceans. We don't even typically find fossils in today's oceans. All of our fossils are really up on the land in the continents, as if they were propelled across the continents, rapidly buried by mud, dirt, debris, and sediment that was deposited by water. So we would see a world that existed from creation until the flood, but what we don't see is massive death and burial. So the pre-flood world is what we see from that Bass limestone up until we get to the bottom of that Tapeats sandstone. And likely we believe that these layers were tilted out of place at the beginning stages of the flood. As the flood waters are sweeping onto the continents, the fountains of the deep are breaking forth, tectonic forces and processes are at work. We would see a tilting of this landscape. And then we have water propelling across the continents in a grand, huge, massive event. And that shears off the landscape, basically taking these tilted layers, cutting them off flat, and shearing them off as they go across the continent. And then the layers, beginning from the Tapeats sandstone that we see here all the way up, begin to stack up rapidly, very, very quickly. Now, we're going to talk about the Tapeats sandstone in a little bit in finer detail. But it gives us kind of a snapshot of what happened. And if you look underneath the tilted layers, you begin to see a little bit of other layers. You see that Zoroaster, kind of the pink, that's the Zoroaster granite. And then we have the greenish stuff that's called the Vishnu schist. And it's kind of the metamorphic and igneous rocks, kind of the basement rocks, the crystalline basement rocks, we call them, of the Grand Canyon. And they are the foundation or basement rocks, not only of the Grand Canyon, but pretty much around the world. Typically around the world, you go down deep enough, you get into igneous and metamorphic rocks, just like we see here at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Those rocks are rocks we believe that were deposited, were created, you might say, at the beginning of creation itself, day 3 of creation. The Bible tells us that God drew all the water to one place so that dry land would appear, right? You look at this, these rocks, these foundation rocks, we believe were part of the geology, part of the earth itself that was created, or at least brought to the surface through that water on day 3 of creation. And guess what? We have evidence of that too in the rocks. The rocks cry out. Now, an interesting rock layer that you don't see on this list, but it's actually a member of the very bottom of what we call the Bass limestone. So that kind of purplish rock layer you see there. At the bottom of that Bass limestone, we have another rock layer. Okay, the Hattuata or Hatauta conglomerate that you see here. And that conglomerate is made up of lots of different rocks that are added to it. So this is a rock sample that has been taken up and placed alongside what we call the Trail of Time, which was developed by a geologist over New Mexico State University, Carl Karlstrom. And so Dr. Karlstrom has been, he put together basically this rocks along the Trail of Time to kind of show you the Grand Canyon. Now, it's basically a horizontal representation of what you might encounter in a vertical descent down through the Grand Canyon. So from starting at the top layers, as you walk along the Trail of Time, you get deeper and deeper into the canyon. Now, in the model that they've created, they also say that you go deeper and deeper into time. But what we look at is right there at the very bottom, right above the basement crystalline rocks of the Grand Canyon, we find this interesting conglomerate, the Hatauta conglomerate, which if you look at it, is made up of all sorts of rocks. And some of them are pretty small. Some of them are actually pretty good size. But if you look at it, what we find in there is no fossils, no dead and buried things, no evidence of life whatsoever. And we also find in there that these rocks are rocks that have come from underneath that were plucked up from some of the basement rocks, the schist and the granite and the gneiss and quartz and all kinds of stuff like that. And these rocks have been plucked up and they've been tumbled. You can see for yourself, look how rounded these rocks are. They've been tumbled, they've been mixed together, they've been churned up. And this is at the very bottom of the Grand Canyon supergroup layers. Now, what are we seeing there, Caleb? We see what I believe is the very act of day 3 creation. As the crystalline basement rocks are rising, as the waters are draining off them, the waters are going to one side so the dry land would appear, we would have an act of erosion on the surface of our planet. As waters in mass are receding off the continents, it's eroding the landscape. It's eroding that Zoroaster and the Vishnu that we see there. And those rocks are being tumbled and churned up, and they're being added together. And those are what we see as a conglomerate, basically a big mash of all kinds of big erosion. You look at these rounded rocks, they look very much like rounded river rocks, as if they underwent some kind of big water tumbling action, you might say. And that's exactly what we see from a day 3 creation.
Wow.
And then we look at it, we get to the Tapete Sandstone, which is another massive erosional plain. So we actually have 2 big erosional plains underneath the Bass Limestone at the bottom of that Grand Canyon supergroup, and another major one at the contact point between that and the Tapete Sandstone.
All right. Oh, that's awesome. So really it comes down to these creation and pre-flood rocks, and then the beginning of the flood on the Tapete Sandstone where the great unconformity is at.
Yeah.
But that also seems that secular geologists they're saying there's missing gears in the great unconformity. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned the great unconformity because it's one of my favorite features in the Grand Canyon. On our river trips that we take down through there, we actually get to see and encounter the great unconformity. It's seen on no matter whatever river trip you come with us on, we're going to see, and actually most of the trips, be able to get hands-on with the great unconformity, which is a very powerful thing if you look at it and realize what it is we're talking about.
Yeah.
Now, that great unconformity is where that Tapete Sandstone comes straight across there. Underneath there, where it contacts, either the basement, the crystalline basement rock, we have this great unconformity or the greatest nonconformity there. We look at here, we see that and the contact point between the sediments underneath there, or the contact point between that and the crystalline basement rocks. We see this massive erosional plain going straight across there. You can see it in the image I've got here. In the top left picture, you can see these rocks kind of going almost straight up and down, and then halfway it goes straight across. Now that halfway straight across, that is the Tapete Sandstone, okay? In the bottom right, you can also see the contact point going straight across there. The bottom left picture, you can see that is our founder, Tom Vail, up there showing one of our river trips from 2011, my first ever river trip to the Grand Canyon, showing us the great unconformities. He kind of hiked up there. You can barely see him. He's up there kind of in blue-gray in the shadows. But yeah, Tom Vail is up there showing us the great unconformity. Now, if you realize what the great unconformity is, as we talked about, the fossil record explodes into existence where that Tapete Sandstone erosional boundary begins. And it happens to be the exact same place where we find a worldwide explosion within the fossil record. Remember? The Cambrian explosion. That Cambrian explosion of death, as we call it, is the exact same place, the exact same moment in time, if you will, where we happen to find worldwide water erosion on a grand, huge scale, okay? This Tapete sandstone, you can see it shears off these tilted angled layers. These tilted angled layers should continue rising on up, but something has happened to shear them off, to cut them off flat, basically to plane them off, and then stack up 4,000 feet of sandstone, limestone, and shale that we see here at the Grand Canyon. That worldwide big water event, of course, I believe is a flood. So we believe that the Tapete sandstone is one of the first layers that we see deposited at the Grand Canyon. We can see from the rim, we can see on most river trips. There's one other little layer sometimes we see here called the 60-mile formation, which we also believe is part of that, but you don't really see that very often. But this Tapete sandstone that you see there on the map really represents the first significant layer that we see deposited during Noah's flood and evidenced here at the Grand Canyon. And again, the rocks cry out. We go and examine what this Tapete sandstone tells us, and it shows us, my friend, direct physical evidence of fast-moving water erosion, okay? When you examine the Tapete sandstone, in fact, you can see in this picture, the couple pictures here, there's actually a lot of little white rocks kind of embedded right at that contact point. Now, most of that is what we call Shinemu quartzite. Shinemu quartzite is a very strong, solid rock, almost like like a quartz rock. It's very strong and solid. These are rocks that have been plucked up from the crystalline basement rock underneath, and they've been added to the slurry, and they've been churned and pulverized, and we find numerous rounded rocks and stones embedded within the Tapete sandstone, especially right there at the contact point, at the lowest point. What we see here evidence of is a massive amount of water moving and plucking up stuff and eroding it, and just like fast-moving water does, like rivers and streams, it tumbles these rocks, knocking off the sharp edges, rounding them smooth. We find this deposited straight across there. And not only do we find little small rocks, we find boulders sometimes that have been eroded and rounded and left behind within this Tapete sandstone. We're talking about a massive amount of water, okay, moving very, very quickly, fast-moving water like rivers and streams, but on a much bigger scale than a river or stream. We're talking about continent-wide sediment. Now, the secular geological model oftentimes would look at this and they would say, boy, the crystalline basement rock you see there has been eroded straight across there. That Tapete sandstone sits on top of there. We see no fossils and fossil explosion within life. And they begin to estimate that we are missing a tremendous amount of time. And that's what you mentioned there, Caleb. They estimate that between that crystalline basement rock and the sedimentary rocks directly on top of it, that we are missing up to 1.2 billion years of Earth's geological past. Now, I didn't say million, I said billion, right?
Wow.
1.2 billion years have simply gone missing, they would say, because that amount of time that would take for these slow, gradual processes to happen, they would say. So looking at this, we see that there's an erosional boundary. There's also an explosion within the fossil record, but no evolutionary precursors of life. They look at this and they say there must have been a tremendous amount of missing time. But you know what else they say in the secular literature? They say we don't know exactly what happened during that 1.2 billion years of Earth missing time for this great unconformity, but there must have been a tremendous water event. That is in black and white. They say that because the physical evidence is undeniable. When you look at these rocks, the rounded rocks, the physical evidence is that there was at some point a big water event. Okay. So then the next question really needs to come in. Well, how big was that big water event? You look at things like the Tapete sandstone that we're talking about, and when you examine that Tapete sandstone, the question needs to come in, well, how big was that big water event? You might even call a flood, my friend.
Yeah.
Well, when you examine that Tapete sandstone, you see that not only is the Tapete sandstone found covering at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, but as you see in this map here, the Tapete sandstone stretches across North America. That's what you see in the yellow. It goes further up into Canada and pushes out further there. The Tapete sandstone, though, covers, you can see all the way across the United States. So wait a minute.
Wow, that's amazing.
If we had a continent-wide, fast-moving water deposited sediment layer called the Tapete sandstone, that means we must have had a continent-wide, fast-moving water event to do it.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much more I really need to say about that being a flood event, because that's basically the definition of a flood, my friend.
Yes.
You begin to look at this and you see that not only is it found at the Grand Canyon, but that same fast-moving water-laid sediment is found propelled across the entire continent. So we have direct physical evidence, I believe, of a continent-wide flood, a continent-wide transportation water event, a continent-wide flood. But guess what? It gets even bigger than that.
Wow.
Because not only do we find the Tapete Sandstone covering all of North America, basically all across the United States here, we find that very same layer of rock, that very same Tapete Sandstone goes all the way across North Africa. We find it up into southern Israel and into Jordan up there. You can see on the top left picture there, this was actually by Dr. Bill Barrick. He is our chairman of our board for Canyon Ministries here, but he was over there with geologist John Whitmore last year, and they were kind of traveling around Israel and up into Jordan. And this is actually taken in Timna National Park, which is in southern Israel there. But the blue line shows you the great unconformity, just like you would see at the bottom of the Grand Canyon.
Oh, wow.
And you can look at the picture to the right of it. Grand Canyon on the left, southern Israel canyons, little slot canyons on the right. The geology matches up, my friend. The same equivalent of the Tapete Sandstone that we have here at the Grand Canyon is also found covering North Africa. It's found all the way up into parts of Europe, up into southern Israel, into Jordan. And in fact, if you look at or ever watch the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade,
Oh yeah, of
well,
course.
at the end of that movie, they go to the big stone temple, which is actually Petra, and it's found in southern Jordan. And Petra is actually carved into the very same sandstone equivalent that you see here at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, that same Tapete Sandstone equivalent all the way across there. Now, we're not just talking about a continent-wide flood event. We're talking about now direct physical evidence of a cross-continental flood event. In other words, a worldwide flood. That sediment, that peanut butter, if you will, that's being carried across the bread, goes all the way across two pieces of bread, if you will, all the way across to the other side of the continent before it thins out and tapers out and disappears.
Yeah.
So this is only one layer of the Grand Canyon we're talking about. We see many other layers and tremendous evidence of massive distribution of this massive movement by water across multiple continents. Again, we're looking at a flood event. That great unconformity, we believe, is not the result of slow, gradual processes of slow erosion or changes over 1.2 billion years. We believe it is the fast-moving water event, fast-moving, pulverizing, eroding, scouring, not only of water, but dirt and debris and sediment that acts like liquid sandpaper, almost like a giant boulder with bulldozer with massive boulders rolling and tumbling across the continents, a huge scouring event that scours down the plains rapidly and then stacks up layers very, very quickly without time for erosion in between, like we see at the Grand Canyon, for example, here between the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Shale beneath it. A thin knife-edge boundary as if layers were stacked up very, very quickly without time. You know, we're not talking about 1.2 billion or a few million for this picture here. We're not talking about millions of years of slow, gradual processes. Otherwise, you would expect to find millions of years of surface erosion on the top of that red layer. We don't see a high amount of erosion of valleys and channels and gullies and eroded surface. We see thin, flat, knife-edge boundaries without time for erosion in between, stacking up layers almost like pancakes across the Grand Canyon. And that's the physical evidence we see. Rapid processes, I believe, my friend.
Yeah, that's so awesome. No, that's great. That's great. Just seeing the widespread, rapidly deposited layers. That's the exact type of evidence we would expect for a global catastrophic flood. Yeah. And it's so exciting seeing this, and our viewers, man, you guys put your questions in, and hopefully we'll get to those in a little bit. But this is something that everybody needs to hear about is the flood. And this is why Canyon Ministry exists, not just to tell people there was an event, but there was an event in God's word and what that tells us about God's past judgment and coming judgment. Of course, God is merciful, and he preserved a remnant in the ark, and all those who are in the ark of salvation in Christ, who is the door of salvation, will be saved by the second judgment coming with the return of Jesus. So this is fascinating as we see the Tapete Sandstone and many other layers are widespread around the world. Now, there's several spots like the Great Unconformity that there's missing times on. There's more than just that spot, right? Right. Yeah. There are unconformities between many of these layers that exist, between the Muav limestone and the Redwall limestone. I mean, there are unconformities between much of this.
where it doesn't, an unconformity basically in a geological perspective means it doesn't match up. It doesn't match a completed sequence, if you will. And so that's only one unconformity. That's the most well-known because the Great Unconformity is one of the most dramatic as far as their time scale. It's also a worldwide physical feature, which is, like I said, when you look at evidence here over in Israel and Jordan, like in Timna National Park. And then the Great Unconformity is the main one we typically talk about. Sure. It's also one that we can easily see from the rim of the Grand Canyon. So if I'm leading a rim tour out there, I can point out that Great Unconformity. I can show you the tilted, angled supergroup layers and the Tapete sandstone. That's probably the most easy to see and to comprehend for our guests at the canyon. However, you're right, Caleb. There are multiple unconformities throughout there that basically speak to the same thing.
Now, what is the best explanation? Is it basically that the rising and falling tides during these alleged millions of years just didn't lay them down in that area because they were more localized rising areas? Or
are you talking about from like a secular perspective?
Yeah, the secular perspective. Yeah. How do they explain the missing years then?
So I've heard a few different things. One of them would be that the sediment was simply not deposited everywhere like it is in some other places. So for example, if you're making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, if you don't get enough peanut butter on that knife, no matter what the process is, a fast moving flood or a slow gradual deposition, if you don't get enough peanut butter on that knife, you're not going to be able to get to all edges of that bread, right? You're going to have some places where peanut butter doesn't reach. And if you go lay jelly on it, now you could lay jelly across the entire thing and you would have peanut butter and jelly. But in some places, if you didn't get peanut butter to the edge, you might only have jelly. And so looking at it, you're say, well, something is missing here. So that process could be explained by that. And that's what typically I've seen oftentimes, is it perhaps wasn't here, or sediment that was here was somehow eroded away in this locality, or maybe across a continent, that sediment was eroded and then new stuff came on top of it. And we kind of would see the very similar thing happen during the flood. In fact, we have sediment that's carried across a continent in big scale, but not all of the sediment covers the entire world. There are places where it thins out and disappears and tapers out. There are also places where during this flood event, with the currents and, massive wave movements, something that had just gotten deposited maybe even 24 hours before has now been subsequently eroded away. When another current comes through, whatever it is that ends up settling out through that is what we end up with in the picture, the snapshot of the flood. So yes, there are some explanations that comes into maybe how some of this would have happened. But by and large, when you look at it, these great unconformities typically represent a catastrophic process within the evidence of the rocks themselves, the way that the rocks are deposited and what is actually left behind, like those nicely rounded rocks within the Tapete sandstone. It's evidence of catastrophic.
Yeah, no, that's a helpful explanation. And I think that if we look at the layers, there's certain things that we should expect if they were laid down rapidly, like several that you mentioned. When we look at, say, the fossils in each layer, and for example, there was one thing I was reviewing, Dr. Andrew Snelling, just a phenomenal creation geologist. One of the talks he was giving, he was mentioning that the footprints of some of the creatures are in a lower layer than the actual bodies. Is that right? Maybe you can explain that some more.
Absolutely, Caleb. That is exactly right. Yeah, Dr. Andrew Snelling is a fantastic geologist.
Yes.
He has been working with a ministry called Answers in Genesis for a number of years. Dr. Snelling also does at least 2 river trips with us each year, typically. In fact, I was just talking with Dr. Snelling this morning about one of his research projects, but you're exactly right. Let me fast forward, jump to here to some of the fossils here. And exactly. So here's here you go. Here's some pictures of some of the fossils we have at the Grand Canyon, okay? The bottom picture on the left here, that is a river trip that Andrew and I did last year, a 9-day river trip through the Grand Canyon. And here we are in Redwall Cavern and showing people some fossils that are embedded within one of the big limestone chunks that's right here. And basically crinoids and some corals and things like that we find there. And so kind of pointing out some of those fossils. But we also find not only, marine fossils like, seashells and clams and corals. We also do find footprints or trackways within the Grand Canyon. Oh, wow. Now, most of those trackways are in a slab of rock and layer called the Coconino sandstone, and that's near the top of the Grand Canyon typically. So we have the Kaibab limestone, then we have the Toroweap formation, then we have the Coconino sandstone, and within that Coconino, there are actually, dozens and dozens of known fossil trackways. In fact, if you go to the Grand Canyon National Park, and if you ever go to where Bright Angel Lodge is at, you walk to the other side of Bright Angel Lodge, you have a nice view of the canyon over there and Bright Angel Canyon going off. But there's some nice little, slab benches that are made up of rocks. There are actually 2 slabs of rock right there that actually have fossil trackways of creatures walking through them, and thousands of people sit their backsides on top of these fossil trackways and never even know that they're sitting on something like that.
Wow.
And I've taken a few groups up there and pointed them out, and somebody sitting next to us said, I had no idea. I've been sitting here for half an hour. I didn't even notice that. It's like, it's actually that common. Now, what is not common and what we actually don't find at all are the body fossils of these creatures that deposited these fossil trackways. These trackways are created by either reptiles or amphibians that were walking along, and typically the evidence that we see there is that they were walking along a water-saturated sand dune. What does that sound like? Maybe a flood, maybe some water involved. Not dry desert dunes. Dry desert dunes do not preserve nice toe prints and claw marks like we find in these sandstone sediment deposits.
Right.
We find highly defined claw marks even, and footprints. And if you walk in a dry desert dune, Caleb, what's going to happen? You'll leave maybe depressions, but you're not going to leave a footprint nicely defined. You're not going to be able to see all your toes there. If you want to leave toe prints, you're going to need to walk in wet sand. Well, it's exactly what we see here. Wet sand that either as the tides were advancing, maybe as they receded, that it opened up some open, basically plains or sections where tidal flats were there and creatures were climbing, or as the floodwaters are coming and they're trying to climb up these sand dunes, underneath water, as water's coming towards them, they're being buried. These footprints are being buried and preserved for us. Now, the interesting thing, these footprints that we find are always found going either uphill or uphill at an angle, as if these creatures are either going against a current or being pushed aside by a current. Every single case. In fact, just this year, in fact, 2020.
That's awesome.
We were up at the Grand Canyon at a 2-day conference up there. Every year we have a big annual conference where national park guides and rangers come together, and we have a 2-day conference about Grand Canyon geology and history and climate, things like that, and the animals and the plants, and all kinds of different speakers. One of the speakers, though, she was talking about the fossil trackways of the Grand Canyon and highlighting a number of them. And after her talk, I kind of went up and was asking her a couple of questions, not to be pestering from a creation perspective by any means. She didn't even know who I was, but I just said, so as far as I know, all the trackways we find are always found going uphill on one side of a dune, but are never found going down the backside, the downhill slope. In other words, they only are found on one side, never on the other side. How do we explain that? And she said, honestly, I don't know. It's a mystery. Question. Her best guess, she said, the only thing we can think of is maybe there was a damp side of the dune from, a nearby sea or ocean, and, an onshore flow kind of brought some dampness to one side of the dune and didn't create it on the other. And I said, that's example in every case, right? And she's like, yeah, it's a mystery. It's weird, is what she ended up saying. So I said, well, thank you. I really thanked her for her time on that. And, but it's interesting. They're only found going up one side of slope, always going uphill, and never found going downhill on the backside. Now that cannot be explained, I believe, in a secular model very easily. Right. But if you look at what the flood is doing, the flood is, bringing on water and currents. Animals and creatures are trying to escape to high ground. So they're climbing up these dunes to get to high ground. Once they get to the top of that dune, the current of water behind them, and now Caleb, is pushing them over the top of that dune. They're landing on the bottom of the next dune, and they start climbing up that dune, or they're getting pushed aside. In many cases, we have examples where animals are actually going not straight up, but over at an angle. And the direct evidence is that they were being moved by some kind of current. Now, big currents of water pushing these animals. Now, we find the fossil trackways, the footprints. But as you mentioned, what we don't find is the actual animal itself. Yeah. Not one single time in the 150 years of studying the Grand Canyon, of looking at all these layers of the Coconino Sandstone, have we ever found a single animal body fossil of one of these animals that were walking up these hills, which doesn't make a lot of sense. You got to think about it. If we find their trackways, the trackways are there, the animals were living there, why don't we find the animals there? Where we find these animals, the terrestrial animals, these reptiles, are actually in layers above that. So at the top of the Grand Canyon, we have the Kaibab limestone. Above that, as you go to nearby regional locations, we have the Moenkopi Formation and the Chinle Formation. Now, in that Chinle Formation, layers above the Grand Canyon is actually where we find the body fossils of these types of animals.
So you're saying, according to the secular model, you have their footprints and their bodies millions of years apart.
Exactly. They are separated. The fossil trackways are separated by millions of years in their estimation from when you actually can find the dead and buried animal. That doesn't make any sense. We should find, if we find the trackways, you should find the body fossils, the animals. We don't. However, if you look at what the flood describes, as animals are trying to escape the encroaching flood waters, and not only that, but sediment and mud that's encroaching and sweeping them, throughout the currents and sweeping over them, these animals are trying to escape, and for a moment, they're successful. They're escaping, they're swimming, they're getting to high ground. Eventually, though, as the Chinle Formation, you might say, some of that sediment gets sweeping across there. Now they're caught up in it, and now they're buried. They're no longer able to escape, but the turbulence of that deposit actually now is burying these animals. We actually see some of the evidence of that turbidity. At the bottom of that Chinle Formation, we actually see another big conglomerate layer that's actually churned and mixed up. So we have evidence that, hey, this layer started coming in rapidly, and with no escape, these animals now get buried rapidly in there. And we also do find, dinosaur footprints in that Chinle Formation. Same thing as waters are advancing and receding, we see tidal flats would open up. We have momentary exposures of landscapes where animals are trying to escape floodwaters, and they're leaving their footprints deep within the mud, and then it gets covered by another sediment layer and gets preserved through that preservation process. And so we find fossilized dinosaur footprints not far from where I live, actually, just about an hour and 20 minutes north of me. At Tuba City, up there on the Navajo Indian Reservation, we can find fossil dinosaur footprints and trackways out there. It's pretty cool. But the point is, we find the footprints, and then they're separated by supposed millions of years until we actually find the animals that made those footprints. Now, that is a head scratcher, my friend. That is something that doesn't make a lot of sense unless you look at it from a global flood perspective of this taking place all during this year-long catastrophe. Within a matter of days, we believe that this would happen from when they were left. Maybe even hours, it could be in some cases.
Yeah, that I think that is pretty fascinating when you think it through, and a lot of it's just a logical deduction issue here. Mm-hmm. Now, there's another issue I just recently was reading about of the layers in the Grand Canyon that they say many geologists are saying there's a lack of bioturbation. Can you explain what bioturbation is and why that is significant?
Yes, so let me backtrack here, actually. So bioturbation, basically on the landscape we have today, Caleb, we have plants and animals that are churning and mixing up the soil, right? We have tree roots that are digging down into layers. We have animals that live in the earth and move in the earth, even in the oceans. We have ocean floor, clams and other things that go up and down the seafloor bed, mixing and churning up these layers. Now, what we see here at the Grand Canyon, layer after layer after layer, are no examples really of bioturbation on any grand scale. In this picture here of the Coconino Sandstone and that Hermit Shale right there at that line is actually a very soft layer of sediment. That Hermit Shale it's a shale, so it's actually breakable. You can break it in your hand. It's actually, kind of erodes out into a pretty good slope section. And if you've ever visited Sedona, Arizona, just 20 minutes south of where I am, or 40 minutes, I should say, if you ever visit Sedona, basically Sedona sits on top of the Hermit Shale. And above that, you have some other layers that you can see that are part of the Grand Canyon. Another one called the Schnebly Hill Formation, which is not seen at the Grand Canyon, but is also making up most of the big red layers and the famous formations there in Sedona. But it's a flat and kind of open plain because this Hermit Shale is a highly erodible surface, okay? Now, there should be a tremendous amount of plants and animals and tree roots or some kind of mixing and churning up the top of these layers or the boundaries of these layers. You look at the world today, you look at the Grand Canyon today, you look at the rim of the canyon. Most people think that the Grand Canyon from pictures, they first come up here on a tour with us and they expect it to be all just dry desert and a giant canyon. And it blows them away. When you come up here, we actually have the largest contiguous ponderosa pine forest in the world. We are covered by forest and trees and life all around. We have 5 different climate zones, ecological zones throughout the Grand Canyon. We have, alpine-like conditions all the way down to Sonoran Desert. I mean, it's an amazing array of life and diversity there. But at the very top, covering both sides of the rim, we actually have a tremendous amount of trees and forest growing there. Now, if that were the top layer, say, for example, we had a a ocean that rose over the continent today, okay, and all those plants and animals and trees are living on the surface, then they should be sandwiched in between the existing layer now and whatever layers of sediment were deposited as the ocean slowly moved over here for millions of years. We should find at that boundary, at that contact point, physical signs of bioturbation, of plants and animals living there, churning, mixing up the soil, and evidence of the life that lived on the continent. But you can see here that Hermit Shale and that Coconino Sandstone, no evidence of that churning or mixing up exists right there from plants and animals across the continents. There was no time of millions of years. It's as if they would say, for millions of years, the Hermit Shale sat here as the top layer, and for millions of years, not a single plant or animal lived on there, grew on there, died on there, somehow were fossilized on there. We would say for millions of years, even at the bottom, if it was at the bottom of an ocean floor, which they don't believe the Hermit Shale was actually, but even if it was the bottom of an ocean floor, you would still have evidence of life churning and mixing up. And as those boundaries, as those layers came together, they should continue to be churned and mixed up together. You should see kind of a churning and a steady transition between these layers. But we don't. We see a layer and then new sediment instantaneously brought on top of that, stacked up like pancakes. And that's the case time after time after time, not just here in this example of the Hermit and Coconino, but in every one of these layers we see here at the Grand Canyon, time after time after time, there is very little erosional, planes there, basically very little erosion into the surface, and no real signs of bioturbation throughout the layers of the Grand Canyon.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think that is a really significant point showing that they were laid down rapidly. So what I want to get to next is there's actually a really great video that you guys made with Canyon Ministries on the fossils, and I think we're premiering it today on our show and for you guys.
Yeah,
and
Caleb, this is the first time anyone in the world is going to see this other than us at Canyon Ministries to put it together. So
yes, sir. So I'm excited. You guys, all our viewers now, you get to be a part of the premiere with a new video with Canyon Ministries on the fossil record and Grand Canyon. So let's go ahead and pull that up here.
So one of the evidences that we have for a global flood is what's surrounding us right now where we're standing here. Looking at what we have all around, we have millions upon millions of marine ocean fossils found throughout the many layers of the Grand Canyon. Now that is evidence of a major catastrophic water event of death and burial in a moment's notice. These fossils that we find here are the product of catastrophic death and burial very, very, very quickly. When we look at these fossils, we find that they are broken and shattered and scattered throughout. So it's something to think about, something to ponder. We are over a mile above sea level here and nearly 400 miles away from the nearest ocean, and yet all of these rock layers contain a vast array of marine ocean fossils. Now, thinking about these fossils, we begin to ask the question, how did they form? How did they get up here? Sounds to me like there must have been a pretty big water event that may have swept over the whole known world, and you might call that a flood. Looking at these rock layers, we find that these marine ocean fossils are scattered and littered throughout here. They're not only found here at the Grand Canyon, but these marine ocean fossil layers are found throughout the entire world. Covering mountaintops, we find marine ocean fossils. Even at the top of Mount Everest at 29,029 feet, we find marine fish fossils and seashells. Now, looking at the rock layers we have here, it shows us that there must have been a major catastrophic event, because that's how fossils are formed. Fossils typically aren't formed by slow, gradual processes. If that were the case, then we should find fossils in today's oceans, but we don't. Fossils are found on the continents on the land. Things that die in the ocean today, typically they float, they bloat, they get picked apart by scavengers, they get eaten and consumed. Even entire whale carcasses may sink down to the ocean floor, and down there, tremendous scavengers like crabs and other crustaceans and hagfish and eels that consume even entire whale carcasses, even the bones, very, very quickly. For something to become a fossil, it needs to be rapidly buried by a pretty good amount of sediment, so it is kept out of reach of scavengers and kept in an oxygen-free or anaerobic environment so that it doesn't naturally decay and decompose. Now, those kind of conditions are not happening in the oceans today, which is why we don't find fossils in today's oceans or even forming into today's oceans typically. Our fossils, as I said, are found on the land and the continents. The process for fossils to form is a rapid and catastrophic process that's necessary for fossils to actually form. In today's oceans, we don't find that process happening, and so looking at the rock layers we have here throughout the entire planet shows us that there must have been a major watery catastrophic event of death and burial in a moment's notice. billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth.
All right. Well, great video, man. What a great premiere. That was very well done and so helpful on the fossil record in the Grand Canyon.
Yeah, billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. A little catchphrase that I stole from my friend Ken Ham over there at Answers in Genesis, which, if you think about it, that's exactly what you would expect to find. You know, if we did have a global flood, Caleb, you would expect to find that there would be billions of dead things buried in rock layers, which were laid down by water all over the earth. And when we go and take a look, that's exactly what we find. Yep.
Amen. Well, I'm going to highlight a comment here, and then we can talk about these folded layers we're looking at here. We got Fencer for Jesus. Here's what he said. The mainstream models accuse flood geologists of missing other unconformities. Would not these missing layers simply be a result of comparing the layers to the already established geologic column?
Unconformities. I have not heard that accusation before of flood geologists missing other unconformities, but the way I look at an unconformity is that this is evidence of fast-moving removal of material, basically. An unconformity to us represents an erosional boundary or an erosional plane, either at the onset or initiation of the flood, perhaps, or during this catastrophic flood process, as these currents of waves are moving and advancing and receding. I mean, things are moving and getting not only deposited rapidly, but also eroded rapidly. So I would love to be able to examine any other of those questions or accusations. In fact, if you want to send it in to Caleb, I'd love to take a look at what examples from some of the mainstream models, because I would love to tackle that issue. Yeah, that's just a great question.
Yeah, thanks for your
layers already established. Yeah, I love unconformities. To me, an unconformity is a creationist's best friend, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's good question. Thanks for the comment there.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are we looking at here, and why is it significant?
All right, so kind of getting to near the end of wrapping up some things here. This is a fantastic picture, and some of you guys might be familiar with this. I've already mentioned Dr. Andrew Snelling. Dr. Andrew Snelling is one of the world's leading creationist, geologists in studying bent and folded rock layers that we see at the Grand Canyon. And this is a fantastic example of a bent and folded rock layer that we have in what we call the Carbon Canyon Fold. And it's found just before you get into main Grand Canyon proper, when you're still kind of in Marble Canyon, before it really makes its bend and opens up. You're still in this great section, and you can actually see this location from the rim. If you ever go out to Desert View on the east side of the park, you can see where this location is. You can't see the fold, but you can see the general location. And so before you kind of get to this big round turn and the canyon really opens up, we have a fantastic hike that we like to do, especially on our 9-day river trips. And this takes you up to this bent folded rock layer. Now, this is the Tapeats sandstone. Remember that same Tapeats sandstone we're talking about here that covers worldwide? That same layer of rock is what you see here. Now, if you look really closely, you can actually see there are people dotting the hillside. There's some down below. There's actually some right up against there in the shadows. It shows you the scale, which, basically hundreds of feet thick this sandstone layer is. But if you look at it, this whole thing has been bent out of shape. I mean, it's going straight across typically, but it's been bent out of shape. It's not the only example, but to me, it's one of the most dramatic. So we have the Carbon Canyon Fold. We also have 2 folds within, we call the Monument, fold area within the Tapeats sandstone. We have a beautiful, probably the most beautiful fold is right at the helipad where we fly everyone out on a river trip. So River Mile 187, we camp at the Whitmore helipad. And right there at that spot, there's a beautiful fold within the Bright Angel Shale with multiple colored ribbon bands that are a lot thinner. But the interesting thing is a lot of these folds that you see here, this rock has been folded and bent out of shape without really major fracturing taking place throughout. It's not like the rock is snapped. Now, interestingly, looking at these sediment layers like the Tapeats sandstone, for example, they would estimate by the secular models that this Tapeats sandstone, this layer of rock, took hundreds of thousands to millions of years to slowly stack up and to deposit. So the bottom layers should be firmed up in solid rock, while the top layers are still slowly accumulating, being deposited. But you look at this, the entire package of rocks has been tilted out of shape, and it's been tilted without, signs or evidence of fracturing. It becomes a mystery, Caleb, because if this rock was solid, how could you bend it out of shape? If I hand you a slab of concrete, I know you're a strong guy, and we've talked about this before in the last episode, I think, but you're a pretty strong guy, and you probably got stronger since then. But if I hand you a slab of concrete and ask you to bend it for me, you think you could do it?
Well, if my child was stuck underneath it, maybe I would get the dad strength.
Right? Now, you could absolutely try to bend that slab of concrete. Even if you were strong enough, you couldn't necessarily bend it because you apply enough force and pressure, and what's going to happen?
Just crack.
It's going to fracture. It's going to snap.
Yeah.
It's going to break.
Yeah.
So when you examine these layers, we don't find evidence of major breaks. It's not like it's been broken in multiple angles to get to that shape. We find in many cases smooth, uniform, unbroken sections where it's actually been bent out of shape without being broken or fractured. Now, how do you explain that? Well, that is such a major mystery to geologists that has been one of Dr. Andrew Snelling's research projects for the last 4 years now.
Wow.
Some of you may have heard about some of the problems that he encountered with the Grand Canyon National Park in obtaining a research permit to sample some of these rock layers. And it ended up being that whole research permit that went to court and everything. And pretty quickly it was realized by the court system, by the national park actually, that some of the folks that were in charge of that project of basically giving the permit to Dr. Snelling were not playing fair simply because he was a creationist. They were denying his permit based upon him being a creationist and the fact that he was going to be sampling this because he believes it's evidence of rapid deposition and evidence of the flood. And so that came out in court, and right away the court said, yeah, this is not happening. And right away the park said, okay, we're sorry, kind of issued an apology, issued a research permit for Dr. Snelling, who we did a river trip with him, took him down to the canyon to obtain some of these samples, and now is currently undergoing studying and research of that. And we expect there to be results published very soon on the results that he's seen with these rock layers. But what we look at here is these rock layers that we see have not been moved out of shape by slow, gradual processes. In fact, here's a zoomed in picture. Back there's Andrew and I on our last river trip. And there he is at Blacktail Canyon looking at the Great Unconformity. But the picture over there on the right-hand side shows you these bent, folded rock layers. Now, it's such a problem, I believe, it's such a major problem that Andrew has really been trying to tackle this and showcase to the secular geologists, hey, my friends, this rock has not been broken and bent out of shape by breaking or fracturing. It's smooth and uniform, unbroken in many places. And to answer the other problem, or the part of that question, the response oftentimes from the secular geological community has been, well, yeah, of course, Andrew, don't you know that, heat and pressure can bend and metamorphose rock. It can bend rock. We know how rock bends. Rock can be bent by heat and pressure. And absolutely, that is true. Rock can be bent by heat and pressure. And you know what we call it when the rock is bent by heat and pressure? It changes the physical composition and sometimes even the chemical composition of a rock, but it deforms that rock into what we call a metamorphic change, a metamorphic process. If heat and pressure were at play to bending this rock out of shape, we should see evidence of metamorphism. We should see, at least at the bends and these folds, that this rock was bent and folded out of shape. We should see a physical change. We should see a crystalline change within that rock that shows us evidence of basically that was bent by heat and pressure. And that is the exact project that he is tackling right now in response to the secular geological community. Because in our modeling, the way we look at it, this entire package of rocks was deposited during this flood event. And that before this had a chance to settle, not taking millions of years to accumulate, but within a matter of hours to, very quickly, maybe even a couple days, but very quickly, this entire package was deposited. And then rapidly, before it had a chance to firm up, it was bent out of shape and remains locked in that shape to this day. Very similarly to if you are mixing concrete or plaster of Paris, you put it out there, it's still liquefied, it hasn't set up yet. And then over time, depending on how much time and whatever is involved, but you have a chance to push your hand into it, to bend it, to shape it. Once it firms up, though, however, it's now locked into that shape and it can no longer be bent out of shape unless it's bent by this, metamorphic heat and process of pressure, which has not been seen within there. And that's what the research project is, as these samples have now gone to laboratories and are being tested. So the evidence that we see bent and folded rock layers all over the Grand Canyon shows us this entire package of rocks was deposited quickly, and then likewise quickly was also bent out of shape before it had a chance to set and to firm up. In other words, the entire package of rocks was not deposited over hundreds of thousands or millions of years. This entire sequence of rocks was deposited almost instantaneously. Then shortly after that, bent out of shape and now is locked into place today. A remnant, if you will, of a global flood event.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. And thanks for breaking that down for all of our viewers and listeners. We got a comment on the bent rock here. That's also from Fencer for Jesus. He says, the secular model suggests if you get just the right amount of heat and pressure, you can bend the rock without breaking it. This is true, but they can't showcase those conditions being present. That is
absolutely correct. Yep. You can bend rock by heat and pressure, but that has not been shown to be the case within the Tepete sandstone. There's not been a study done to showcase it. That is the process here. And that is exactly what Dr. Snelling is currently, even this morning, is actually working on as part of this project, as I was talking with him about, within this to try to show how this is not the case. We are very intimately familiar with this rock layer, and I've seen in many secular journals or other books that, that talk about against a flood or young earth perspective, they talk about these rock layers. And in many cases, the geologists or some of the people that I've talked to that mention this example have never been there themselves. So they're talking about something, honestly, that they're not quite familiar with, or they're relying on somebody else's, interpretation. Right. However, we go to this place nearly every single year. We are up there at this carbon fold. Andrew Snelling has been, he spent hundreds and hundreds of days at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's like a second home to him. We're very fortunate as a ministry, as an organization, to know this canyon intimately. I have spent myself well over 600 days in this park with tours, taking people and being with people in the Grand Canyon. Dozens and dozens of river trip nights and things down the canyon, hundreds and hundreds of days up on the rim. We love this canyon. We know this canyon so intimately, and that's one of the amazing things about what we get a chance to do. And so we don't just want to say, hey, take my word for it. As a scientist, I don't want to ever say to somebody, just believe me, just take my word for it. No, we as Christians and believers also have a duty for due diligence to showcase and to prove out and to basically study to show ourselves accountable to what we believe in the regards to a worldwide flood in the Bible. So Andrew Snelling, for one, Dr. Snelling has been doing physical research here with the rock samples, sending them off to laboratories, making sure that he's hands off in some of the discoveries that, so it's not said, well, you basically, you fibbed on everything. You made it all sound exactly how you wanted to.
Yeah.
Trying to do everything by the books. And he's actually been doing research and sampling, sent off laboratory samples, for radiometric dating and things like that for over the past 20, 30 years here at the Grand Canyon. But we want to make sure everything's done by the book and that the science, the physical, observable science shows us exactly what we're looking at here. Not just, hey, take my word for it, not just believe it. We as Christians and believers and those who work in the scientific fields and things like that, we have to still also be like any scientist, like a Berean, study and show not only God's word, but also be ready to give an answer to those who call upon us for the reason and hope and faith that lies within us. So we have to be ready to give those answers, even when it comes to the geological scientific world. And you're exactly right. They absolutely can be bent by heat and pressure, but heat and pressure has never been demonstrated to be the cause for this. And like I said, Dr. Snelling's research right now is to showcase that heat and pressure is not seen. He's taking these samples and sending them off and saying, tell me, has this been changed? Has it been, a heat and pressure example here? And even secular laboratories are going to come back with the answers one way or another. And Andrew is a man of integrity that will say, here's what it shows us. Here's what it doesn't show us. And I am just as eager as anyone else to hear about those results that Andrew is now finding.
Yeah, that'll be like a second Christmas for me, at least.
That'll be great.
Read that article.
It has been a highly debated topic. Absolutely. Caleb, I've been in a number of debates and discussion groups with young Earth and old Earth and secular geologists, and that exact fold, in fact, this exact fold right here has been the topic of debate oftentimes, and it gets thrown into conversations left and right. So I am also eager to be able to see this and be up there. So it's exciting. Yeah. So again, the close up here, in fact, the picture with Andrew and I, that was taken, it looks like that was taken at the Carbon Fold this last year on 2019. So we were just finished up that hike up there. It is fantastic. We typically do that on our 9-day trip, which happens at the beginning of the year when it's cooler temperatures. It's a hot place to get to in the summertime, but in the spring, we can oftentimes get up there and do that hike.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, I want to kind of close out showing everyone just the Canyon Ministries video that showcases what you guys do. And then we'll have you stick around and we'll just close out here right at the end of this video.
Perfect. Thanks.
I'm John Elbert, the director of Canyon Ministries. Excited to tell you about the things that we do here in Grand Canyon. One of the things we offer is whitewater rafting trips through Grand Canyon. It's an adventure of a lifetime. We offer 4-day rafting trips, 7-day rafting trips, and 9-day rafting trips, all motorized rafting trips where we get to experience Grand Canyon from the very depths down on the river. It's fantastic. But we also have opportunities for you up at the rim, for those that maybe just aren't into the whole rafting thing or have that time to be able to do that. And so we have 3 different rim tours that we offer every single day of the week except for Sundays, year-round. We have a morning tour and a sunset tour, which are both 4 hours long inside the park. And then we have what we call our full-day tour, which is 8 hours inside the park. Whether you're at the rim or down at the river, what we're going to do is help you to see that you can absolutely trust God's word right from the very beginning. We want to affirm or confirm your faith in God and then equip you to be able to share that with others using the majesty and power of His creation found in and around Grand Canyon. You can find us at canyonministries.org. You'll also find us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. You'll find us on TripAdvisor. We want you to come down here to Grand Canyon, up to the rim of Grand Canyon, experience this incredible place with us, and then share it with the rest of the world.
All right. Well, I want to just thank you again, Nate. It's just been a joy and a pleasure to have you joining us today and just sharing how the Grand Canyon showcases and the global flood that we see in Genesis. This upcoming Friday at 2 p.m. Mountain Time, we're going to talk about the carving of the Grand Canyon, and we'll probably talk a little bit about the Grand Staircase, but primarily the carving of the Grand Canyon itself. So hope you guys will join us again this Friday at 2 p.m. Mountain Time for the second part of our Grand Canyon series. Thanks again, Nate, for joining us today.
Thanks, Caleb. My pleasure. It's always a good time to hang out with you, my buddy, my friend.
Yes, sir. Well, you have a great day. We'll catch you this Friday.